So, this week we're going to talk about asking and answering sociological questions. Essentially, how do we know what we know? The reason that this chapter is important is because it discusses how sociologists come to the conclusions that they've come to. And also, it's really important for you as someone who's going to be a recipient of sociological information and studies and conclusions to understand how to read and understand those studies, but also how to understand the research process and how to understand that information being presented to you was done in a way that is believable, that you know to be true. So let's talk a little bit about how do we know what we know. The thing is that sociologists, while it's not considered a hard science, but rather a social science, studies the social world. It studies people. It studies things that we're a part of. And the conclusions are not common sense, despite what other people might have said or how things even might seem as you read them. So, for example, when asked who talks more, women or men, a lot of people will say women, but sociological research actually shows that men do talk more than women. There are few instances where this isn't true, but in large part, men do talk more than women. Common sense would tell us otherwise. Conclusions also aren't based on stereotypes, but rather by studying the social world in an objective manner to draw conclusions. One thing that sociologists tend to look for are causations and correlations. So a correlation is a relationship between two variables or a relationship between two factors. So for example, if the research question was, well, what is the relationship between income and gender? Sociologists are looking for this relationship for as how one might change, the other might change. So as one's gender might change, how might their income also change? Sociologists might look at the strength of a relationship between two variables or two factors, and also the direction between two variables or two factors. Sometimes, but much less often, do sociologists look at causations. Causation is a case in which there's a correlation in time order, ruling out other factors. Causations are super hard. It's not like if you mix hydrogen and oxygen, you're going to have water. People are always changing and very different and almost impossible to predict. So causations are not very common in sociology. One thing that we have to be careful for are these things called spurious correlations. A spurious correlation is when there seems to be a relationship between two variables, but that relationship is actually being caused by something else. So, for example, there seems to be this relationship between ice cream sales and violent crime. As ice cream sales increase, so too does violent crime increase. But when we really look at those two factors or two variables, we see that the changes in ice cream sales and the changes in violent crime are actually caused by something else: warm weather. You might appreciate this cartoon at the bottom. Someday I want to get married because studies show that married people are happier. A smarter interpretation is that no one wants to marry an unhappy person. You're annoying. With any luck, your soulmate won't be perceptive. Again, showing this misinterpretation of the relationship between two variables, happiness and marriage. So, how do sociologists come to the conclusions that they come to? Well, they do this by engaging in the scientific method, a procedure for acquiring and verifying empirical knowledge. Empirical knowledge being factual knowledge, oftentimes that we can verify with our senses. The scientific method consists of two different things. One, objectivity. Objectivity is very, very important. To be objective means that we're going to be unbiased, that we're not going to insert our own opinion into the social research, into what we're studying, into what we're seeing, into the conclusions that we're drawing. How easy is this when humans are studying other humans? Almost impossible. So in sociology, objectivity is more of a goal than an actual reality. So for example, we look at these pictures. What's happening in this picture? What's happening in this picture? What's happening in this picture? And what's happening in this picture, right? And the first, we might see the person is laughing. We might say the person is crying. We might see the person is acting out a scene. We might say the person is opening their mouth so someone can look and see how bright and white their teeth are, or big their tonsils are, right? When the two people are touching hands, are they completing a business deal? Are they meeting for the first time? Are they feeling for how soft the palms of the other person's hands are? Is one pulling the other out of danger? In the top right, is that person involved in an eating contest? Are they threatened in some way, need to consume as much calories as they can before they have to hightail it out of there? Did they make a bet? Did they lose a bet? Right? The way that we experience the social world influences the way that we interpret the social world. We give meaning to what we see. This is something we're going to explore later on in the semester. So it's almost impossible for us to be objective, especially when we're just looking at something. Our interpretations might not always be the correct interpretations. And this is very important for sociologists to understand and to be aware of as they are conducting sociological research. Objectivity was something that Max Weber was very, very interested in. He thought that sociologists should practice what he called value-free sociology. This is sociology in which a person's values could play a part in terms of what they were studying. He thought people should study things that they're interested in, but their observations and their conclusions should be without value. They should not have a vested interest in the results of their sociological research. I like this cartoon because I think that sociologists, humans studying other humans, are kind of like the foxes here. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin today's debate on whether fox hunting should be banned, I would like to remind you of the importance of objectivity. We must not allow our emotions cloud our judgment. It's kind of hard to do that when you're talking about the own demise of your species. Not that sociology necessarily does that. So, one thing Max Weber said as sociologists engage in value-free sociology is that they have to deal with what he called inconvenient facts. Inconvenient facts being conclusions or findings that don't necessarily mesh well or jibe or are consistent with a person's beliefs. For example, even when they do the exact same jobs and have the exact same educational background, men tend to earn more money than women, and whites tend to earn more than African Americans. In the United States, while this is a very well-studied factual reality, sometimes it's hard to swallow because the ideal in the United States is equality, something we should have, but the reality is much different. Whether students get into college has more to do with their parents' socioeconomic standing than with their own intelligence or high school grades. Again, goes against the core beliefs in the United States, right? That if you work hard, you can be successful, and that your success is a result of your hard work, not necessarily the hard work of your parents or the socioeconomic status of your parents. So to be a sociologist is to deal with findings that might go against what you believe, what your values are. When engaging in scientific research, again, sociologists use the scientific method, this procedure for acquiring and verifying empirical knowledge. One important component of that is objectivity, to be unbiased, and another is that this procedure be systematic, meaning that there is a set of procedures, there are a set of steps that are followed. And this is true across all boards. So whether you're taking a sociology class or a biology class, the scientific method is going to be the same. There's a set of 7 steps, and sometimes they're lessened to 5 or, increased to 8, but more or less they follow the same general process, right? You identify a problem, you conduct a literature review, you form a hypothesis, you choose a research method, you collect your data, you analyze your data, and you disseminate the findings. And following the systematic procedure is going to help ensure that the conclusions that you draw are accurate. Now, when choosing a research design, as your book discussed, there are 2 general umbrellas that research designs fall under, either quantitative research or qualitative research. And if you haven't heard this before, here's an easy trick to remember the difference between the 2. Quantitative research oftentimes collects data that is numerical in form. So I like to remember that N in quantitative stands for numbers. Whereas qualitative research oftentimes collects data that is non-numerical, oftentimes taking the forms of words or descriptions. So I like to think of the L in qualitative as standing for language, N for numbers, L for language. Use that if it's helpful to you. So as your book talks about, in that 4th step, you pick a research design and then you collect the data. So what considerations does a a sociologist make in choosing a research method under the quantitative or qualitative research design. There are oftentimes 4 different things that a researcher considers. One is the information that they're seeking. Do they want to know in-depth information about individuals? So, for example, if a researcher is studying dating relationships, do they want to know about negotiations that take place in online dating that move the relationship from a virtual conversation to a physical interaction? They might conduct interviews, they might analyze the conversations that take place online, they might look at the body language in the conversations that take place on the first date. Or do sociologists just want to know about who begins relationships with online dating? They don't need to know about the intricacies of the relationships and communications, but rather are relationships people in start as online relationships. So depending on the information people seek, they're going to either engage in quantitative or qualitative research. Quantitative oftentimes studying larger populations, more macro in scale, and qualitative studying smaller populations, more micro in scale. The competence of the researcher is also really important. If you're a people person and you love interacting, then maybe you'd be more likely to engage in ethnographic research or interviews. But if you're really good at math and numbers and like to avoid a lot of social circumstances, then maybe you'd go for a more quantitative research design, looking at historical records or analyzing existing data, conducting surveys. Resources are really important. Ethnographic research, participant observation. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. Who's going to pay your bills while you're living with another population to understand what their life is like? If you're going to have somebody do that for a long period of time, sure, interviews, ethnographic research might be good for you. But if you're limited on resources, then you might be more likely to engage in a quantitative research design. And then lastly, access. Say you want to study prison gangs. Well, not a great likelihood that you'll be able to sit down on one-on-one interviews asking people about all the violence that they engaged in as part of a prison gang. Information might be much more easily accessed if you're looking for all the crimes that have taken place within a prison that have been deemed or identified as gang-related. So these are the 4 considerations that sociologists take in determining whether they are going to collect quantitative or qualitative data and which research method within those research designs they are going to engage in. What makes good research? 4 different points. One is validity. Does the study actually measure what it is intended to measure? If, for example, if we wanted to study religiosity, we couldn't ask people how many times they attended a religious institution, because maybe some people attend religious institutions for the social benefits. Maybe some people are forced to attend religious institutions. Maybe it's just out of habit. Attendance doesn't necessarily capture religiosity. So is the study valid? Does it measure what it was intended to measure? Reliability. Can you replicate the research and get the same exact results? Are you actually getting the results that you have meant to get? Generalizability. Will the findings of this study apply to some other population or group of people? Can we take what we know about the population studied and apply it to the population at large? And then lastly, what I've deemed here reflective. Does scientists reflect on the limitations of the study? As your book talks about, just being studied, a group can change their behavior, and a sociologist has to know that their presence can influence the behavior of the group that is studied, and needs to be able to reflect on that and reflect on the limitations of the study. Because we're people studying other people, there are always going to be limitations. Lastly, and very importantly, is ethics. It's important that as researchers conduct research, they do no harm. This is something that's become more popular post-World War II and is insisted upon within the discipline of sociology. The ASA, or the American Sociological Association, has set up guidelines, which I've attached online for you to see, of how sociologists should conduct research so that they do no harm, so they don't run into the problems that Loud Humphreys did, as you'll read about for your first discussion. And one way to ensure ethical research is through an institutional review board. So, this is a board, oftentimes at academic institutions, that is made up of one's peers and colleagues that review the research to determine whether it is in fact ethical or actually not ethical. So, best to you as you complete your application assignments, discussing research ethics, and then also looking at how sociological research is conducted and reported on by analyzing either a qualitative or quantitative research.